about her mom told her dad that they were wanting to move in with
Yeah, I
her.
think she.
Her dad said no or whatever.
How do you?
I didn't
What?
want to interrupt the conversation. It sounded interesting.
Morning, Mr. Klein.
How are you guys doing today?
I'm tired.
Tired.
Supposed to get up to 63 degrees today. I was half tempted to move this outside, but it would have taken too long a time to get everything out there. So,
It's supposed to rain this afternoon.
oh, well, that sucks, but it's supposed to get up to 63 degrees still. That's pretty
I
good.
know. About time.
So I set aside the first part here to talk about the man who mistook his wife for a hat for a little bit. Have you guys been keeping up with the reading on it, or crickets? That's okay. If you haven't, we're going to continue on. Actually, yesterday I finished up Unit 3, Behavior and Cognition. So I thought I might as well just go ahead and jump into Unit 4 here, since this is pretty much just a lecture-based discussion. So let me open up our first slides on Unit 4. And this unit is all about psychological development, how we progress in our lives from infants to, old age, basically, and how we develop psychologically during this time. So did you know that when you leave a 5-month-old in its crib and you leave the room, that the baby probably thinks you've literally disappeared, that is their logic system? Very young babies don't understand that the people and objects they observe in the world exist even when unseen. Now, that's speculation. I've always wondered, how the heck do you prove that? It's not like a 5-month-old can communicate that to you, but why do babies make this mistake? When do they begin to understand that their parents do not disappear when they leave the room? And questions like these belong to the field of developmental psychology, which was pioneered by Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, who lived from 1896 to 1980. And if you took sociology, you're probably somewhat familiar with Jean Piaget, because we do talk about him in there. In the years immediately following World War I, Piaget was teaching at a school in Paris. And there he became involved in scoring some of the first intelligence tests. And notice that children tended to provide similar reasoning for their wrong answers. And intrigued by this, Piaget eventually moved back to Switzerland and studied how intelligence develops in children. Ironically, the subjects of his studies happen to be his own children. So I'd always be curious. There's some things, I don't know, like if you grew up, would you teach your kid dog is cat just to see what would happen? I mean, that seems kind of odd, but developmental psychology is the study of how we change over our lifespans. Physical, intellectual, and emotional growth all contribute to this psychological development. And physical changes during prenatal development, like exposure to alcohol, can have long-lasting cognitive consequences. Not being able to feel love from parents and form attachment can result in social impairments as well. So we'll look at studies designed to investigate these kinds of relationships, as well as at several theories of developmental stages proposed by Piaget and by other psychologists like Erik Erikson and Lawrence Kohlberg. Piaget focused mainly on cognitive changes, or how we think and reason. Erikson focused more on changes in motivations, why we do, what we just talked about with the last unit there. And Kohlberg on changes in moral thinking, what is right, what is wrong. Developmental psychologists also seek to identify continuities in development, or things that stay the same from childhood to adulthood. So we'll talk about some of those continuities as well. And this can help us understand all sorts of psychological processes more completely, from visual perception to language use. So as an example, let's take a look at a study by psychologists at Imperial College in London in 2010. Using a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, they scanned the resting state networks in the brains of 70 babies. So this is the fMRI machine. It gives a nice color picture of the brain and where electrical activity is happening. So the babies are in the restful part. They put them in the machine and they just look at their brains to see where the activity is. And what they found is that resting state networks, which are parts of the brain that remain active even when we're sleeping, were developed to an adult level by the time babies reached a normal term birth. Scientists had previously thought that one of these networks played a key role in introspection and daydreaming. So if that's true, then babies are fully capable of thinking about themselves and daydreaming at birth. So the results of the London study mean that either that newborn babies are capable of daydreaming, which was previously thought not to be true, or that the previous theory about which network regulates daydreaming is incorrect. I'd like to think that babies are sitting there daydreaming. I think but what does a baby daydream about? Gosh, that milk was really good. I could stand another milk, right? I mean, it's just fascinating to me to think about what a baby would daydream about. So studying babies gave the psychologists new insights into introspection and daydreaming, processes more commonly associated with adults. Developmental psychology does not just study infants and children in a vacuum, though. It tries to connect these stages with a more complete understanding of what it means to be human. Ultimately, as in many areas of psychology, the fundamental question of nature versus nurture underlies many of the studies and theories in developmental psychology as well. Developmental stages like Piaget's and Erikson's seem to have some innate components. They happen at around the same age in most people and are often tied to physical changes. And yet, parenting certainly has an effect on children's ability to move swiftly and easily through these stages. Children who are neglected or abused often fail to develop normally. And psychological growth is related to both biology and to social interaction. Developmental psychologists typically try to tease these factors apart by theorizing the changes in developmental stages while also identifying the continuities from childhood to adulthood. Now, you're probably wondering how what happens to a baby before it's born is related to psychology. And amazingly, a lot of development happens in utero, in the womb. So we typically think of babies' development inside their mothers as more physical than psychological. But since the brain is growing and changing during this time, healthy prenatal development is actually really important for giving babies healthy, properly functioning minds. Think of it like a computer. Long before a computer ever tries to run software, its hardware needs to be put together properly. And if any of its wires are crossed or missing, the software is not going to run as well. So if the development of the baby's body and brain are disrupted, it can affect the way a baby's mind or software runs on it later. So first, let's cover some of the basics. Each one of us starts out as a zygote, which is an egg cell that has been fertilized by sperm. And once fertilized, the egg cell begins to divide itself into 2, then into 4, then into 8, etc., multiplying itself into a little cluster of cells. And while all this is happening, the zygote heads down to the uterus and tries to attach itself to one of the uterine walls. If it does, and only about half of them are successful, it's called an embryo. And this embryo continues to divide itself and grow larger, but something else really important and cool starts to happen as well. The cells begin a process known as differentiation, where they start to turn into all the different kinds of cells in our bodies and specialize. So blood cells, skin cells, heart cells, things like that. So the cells before differentiation are kind of like high school students. They all take basically the same subjects. They earn the same high school diploma. But when they get to college, they start majoring in different subjects. One might turn into a biology major, another into an English major. And students in college are more like the cells in an embryo after differentiation. They start to specialize in different subjects or functions in the body. So how many of you have ever heard of stem cells? Just raise your hand if you've heard of stem cells before. Okay, stem cells are those pre-specialized cells that you find in a zygote. That's really what they are. So you collect those and you experiment with them to see if you can get them to develop into certain specialized cells that you can then use for transplants or studying. Sometimes some people have even tried getting specialized cells that would reform a limb for someone who's had to have an amputation or something like that. So after about 9 weeks, the embryo is referred to as a fetus. And all the foundations for the baby's major systems and functions have been laid, and the rest of the pregnancy is devoted to helping the fetus grow and fully develop. And if all goes well, a healthy baby is born after about 9 months. Unfortunately, there are things that can interfere with normal prenatal development. I mean, you've probably heard that women who are pregnant shouldn't drink alcohol, for example. And this is because alcohol is a substance known as a teratogen, or a substance that interferes with normal prenatal development. Other teratogens are things like radiation, certain chemicals, some prescription drugs. So to return to our computer analogy, a teratogen is kind of like if when you were building the computer, you accidentally spilled some soda on a few of the wires, you can't clean it up, so you just continue building, but you never really know until you try to run some software whether the spill will affect the computer's functioning or not. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Some babies whose mothers drink alcohol during pregnancy turn out fine, but others are born with fetal alcohol syndrome, a set of abnormalities that include physical differences as well as mental retardation. And I'm not sure how easily you can see this picture here, but this is a picture of a baby with the common facial characteristics of a baby that's suffering from fetal alcohol syndrome. You've got smaller eye openings, a smooth philtrum, which is the little dimple right below your nose there on the lip, a thin upper lip. So exposure to teratogens at certain sensitive periods during development are more likely to result in abnormalities like this. Also, more exposure over a longer period of time is also linked to higher chances of birth defects, more severe birth defects. So even though prenatal development is primarily important for laying the groundwork for a healthy mind, there are a few psychological developments that happen in the last few months of pregnancy. Babies start to become familiar with their mother's voice. In other words, their hearing is somewhat developed in utero, and they begin to recognize their mother's voice, particularly of all others. So once they're born, they prefer it above other voices, which helps with that mother-infant bonding. They may also start to recognize what kind of sounds are present in the language they'll eventually speak. And there's some evidence that fetuses can respond to their mother's moods as well. Some researchers found that they moved around more when their mothers were watching happy movies. I can remember my wife and I went to an Alabama-Tennessee game, and we had, I thought it was great, we sat next to the band, the Alabama band. It was at home, a home Alabama game. We lost. Peyton Manning was the Tennessee quarterback at the time. We lost in overtime. I was kind of ticked about that. But Angela was actually pregnant with our oldest son at the time, and the band would start playing, and he would start kicking around. Obviously, he could hear the band, or at least the vibrations of it. So that was pretty cool to feel over there and feel the baby kicking around for the band playing so loud. But obviously, since they can hear some, that's why people recommend doing things like speaking a foreign language to them in utero, like trying to read that. So they hear all these different phonemes and are more broadly based to pick up on foreign languages and expand their thinking. Things like baby Mozart and things like that. You read to them in utero, it's recommended, things like that. So though some parents are convinced that playing classical music near a developing fetus can improve its intelligence, there's really no evidence that this works. But if they can hear, then certainly, if nothing else, you are expanding the repertoire of things that they're exposed to while their brains are developing, and thus making more neural connections. So if you were standing on the edge of what looked like a steep drop, would you step out into thin air just because someone on the other side was smiling at you? Probably not. We'd go, well, even if I really like that person and they're smiling at me, if I step off here, I'm going to plunge to my death. You'd probably be pretty skeptical of that person's intentions. You might even think they wish you harm by doing that. But when infants are placed in a similar but safe situation, they are happy to crawl out into space if the smiling face on the other side is their mother's. In other words, babies will risk their life to be with their mothers. So what they did is they had these huge platforms, and they had plexiglass on the top of it, a plexiglass ramp. So the babies were in no harm, but obviously it was clear. You could see down to the bottom. You wouldn't be able to tell if there was something there or not. And the babies, because the mom's smiling, come here, baby, come here, honey. The baby was willing to hit that, cliff, even though they could tell there was nothing there, and crawl across to their mothers. So infant development is a complicated process shaped by the interplay of instinct and attachment to a mother or other primary caregiver. And this visual cliff experiment was originally developed as a way to test infants' ability to perceive depth. And I think we've already talked about it in terms of senses when we talked about biological psychology. The cliff, like I said, was made up of two parallel pattern surfaces, one about 5 feet above the other. They put plexiglass extending out from the higher surface so that it still looked like there was a cliff, but infants who didn't perceive it would safely step out onto the plexiglass rather than actually fall down the lower surface. So the researchers found that the infants did perceive the drop-off and tended to avoid it. Later, other researchers used the same setup to test whether the infants who they knew were able to perceive the drop could have their behavior influenced by the presence of their mothers. And they found that they could. Babies whose mothers stood on the other side smiling attempted to cross anyway, while babies whose mothers frowned and looked scared wouldn't cross. And the researchers concluded that a baby's attachment to and trust of its mother is an extremely important part of its ability to explore and grow. And though human babies are born relatively more helpless than other animal babies, they are still born with lots of instincts and abilities that help them grow and also protect them from harm. Infants instinctually grasp objects. If you've ever put your finger in the palm of a baby, it will grasp it. So that comes into their, a finger that comes into their hand. If you rub an infant's cheek, it will turn its head to the side and attempt to suck. This is called a rooting reflex, and it helps infants learn how to nurse. And these instincts, along with babies' natural preference for their mother's voices, help them to form the kinds of attachments they need to figure out difficult situations like the visual cliff. Babies instinctively know that certain kinds of things are dangerous for them. They'll shut their eyes when exposed to a bright light or pull away from a sharp object. And their avoidance of the visual cliff when their mother didn't encourage them is just another example of an instinct to avoid harm. Now, to continue with the mommy theme, let's talk about what a baby perceives a mommy to be. Though the Beatles confidently tell us that all you need is love, behavioral psychologists were skeptical that people and animals need or are motivated by anything other than food, water, shelter, and sex. Psychologists Harry and Margaret Harlow, which we talked about in Unit 1 a little bit back, decided to determine scientifically whether love is something we really need or just a feeling that we have toward things that satisfy our more basic, concrete physical needs. Harry Harlow founded a primate lab and started studying how infant monkeys developed when separated at birth from their mothers. He put these lonely monkeys in cages with two dolls. One was made out of wire with a wooden head and contained a bottle for the monkey's nourishment. The other was made of soft foam and covered in cuddly cloth. My wife still calls it the terry cloth monkey, but that monkey did not have a bottle or any form of nourishment. And with this setup, Harlow attempted to separate the two things the monkey gets from its mother, nourishment and comfort. The wire mother gave food, while the cloth mother gave warmth and comfort. And the prevailing behaviorist theories of the time would predict that the lonely monkey would quickly grow attached to the wire mother since it dispensed the food. And that's why the baby becomes attached to the mother based on these theories, because they are the source of sustenance. But Harlow was surprised to observe that the monkey spent an overwhelming amount of time with the cloth mother, moving to the wire mother only when they needed to eat. Their affection for the cloth mother had nothing to do with the food and everything to do with warmth and comfort. So to further test the monkey's attachment to the cloth mother, Harlow decided to scare them to see how they'd react. He created an ugly, scary paper monster to surprise and frighten them. And when the monster appeared, the monkey screeched and cried and ran immediately to the cloth mother for comfort and security. For all measurable purposes, the baby monkeys seemed to love the cloth mother and interact with it in the same way they'd interact with a real mother. Harlow concluded that the need for love then has nothing physically to do with survival. The cloth mother didn't give the monkey anything it physically needed, but it is nevertheless important. And I've got a lifetime of experience with this. My kids would fall down and scrape their knee and be bleeding right in front of me. Their mother would be a mile away at her parents' house, and they would rather run a mile away to there for the terry cloth mother than for me to treat them, even though I'm being real nice and caring. Oh, you okay? They're running away from me to go see their mother, the terry cloth monkey. Because mothers are just nice and warm and soft and cuddly, I guess. And I guess I'm just too rough and hard. So not surprisingly, the cloth mother provided a poor substitute for a real mother, as I think you might remember from some of the video we watched in Unit 1. Harlow found that only baby monkeys who were raised with the real mothers and other monkey playmates developed into happy, secure adults. Babies raised by a real mother and without playmates became more fearful and aggressive, And those initially raised by the cloth and wire mothers had trouble learning to socialize with other monkeys when they returned to the communal cages. If you remember from the video, they were sucking their thumb, tugging their ears, hiding, trying to stay away from the other monkeys. It was frankly kind of terrifying. But the monkeys who were raised by the dolls and had no contact with other monkeys actually fared the worst. They developed social impairments that affected them the rest of their lives. The cloth mothers provided an outlet for the monkeys' need for comfort, but not for socialization, which emerged as equally important for normal development. And if you took sociology, you might recall we talked about some children who were born in isolated circumstances and how they never could develop, particularly the language centers of their brains. So Harlow's research had far-reaching consequences. He disrupted the prevailing mindset that love was based purely on physical needs, and he showed that love and comfort were non-physical needs that nevertheless were important to normal development. Obviously, we talked about this, the cruelty of the experiment also drew attention and led to reforms and regulations about how lab animals were treated also as a result. Subjecting infant monkeys to total isolation impaired them for life, and such an experiment would be considered an ethical violation by today's standards. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of these words, but we're going to talk about how these two terms, how do assimilation and accommodation help a child adapt to his environment. And we're going to look at how established and changing patterns of information drive a child's intellectual growth as he learns about cats and dogs. So let's say that Jack is a young boy whose family owns a big shaggy dog named Rufus. And one day Jack visits his grandmother, who has just adopted a new little poodle. And even though this new dog looks quite different than Jack's familiar Rufus, Jack still recognized that the poodle is also a dog. So Jack puts the new object, his grandmother's poodle, into an already established category in the filing cabinet of his brain, dog. The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget called this assimilation. Let's say Jack next visited his aunt who has a cat. Jack points at the cat and says, dog. And his concept of a dog, which successfully included both Rufus and his grandmother's poodle, is too broad. He calls anything that has 4 legs and fur a dog. His father explains that this is a cat, and then Jack adjusts his concept of dog accordingly, and this is known as accommodation. I don't know how many of you know Cullum, graduated last year, but Cullum, when he was little, my wife tended to give all the kids animal nicknames. And Cullum really enjoyed this old Irish song, on Puckar Willa, the mad puck goat, Willa. And Willa goat kind of became his nickname until I had to explain to my wife that Willa is actually Irish for goat. And so she was actually calling him Goat, but Goat overall was his nickname. And he just accepted that as his name. So one day we go to a petting zoo. They have a bunch of goats. And I'm with Cullum. I'm like, Cullum, look, goats. He looks at them for a second, looks up at me, looks at them, and then goes, they not goat, I goat. Like, okay, well, what are they? He looks at them and he goes, they dog. Well, that's because he had assimilated the whole concept of dog, shaggy, furry, 4-legged creatures, and he wasn't one of them. So they couldn't be a goat because he's a goat and they're dog. And so we kind of make fun of him to this day for that. I not goat, or they not goat, I goat. So both are part of Piaget's idea of adaptation, though, or the ways in which children learn about and categorize the world. And both assimilation and accommodation are related to the idea of schemas, which we kind of talked about in 2 units ago in Unit 2, how we organize the world and put it into various categories. Schemas are simply established patterns used to organize knowledge. And schemas underlie how we think in a lot of ways. For example, stereotyping involves accessing a schema about how one type of person usually acts and using it to predict their behavior. Assimilation and accommodation are just ways that children incorporate new information into those schemas. Jack filed poodle under the existing header dog, adding it to his schema of dog, but when Jack encountered a cat, he learned that his schema of dog shouldn't include all 4-legged furry animals, so he adjusted the schema to exclude cats. And we've been talking about assimilation and accommodation in terms of language, but Piaget intended the terms to apply to other kinds of developmental learning as well. For example, he characterized an infant's desire to suck on everything around them as a more abstract form of assimilation. The infant's schema of the world is limited. He can interact with it primarily by sucking, and so he assimilates all objects into the schema of suckable things, just as Jack assimilated all 4-legged furry animals into dog. As infants grow, they begin to modify their schemas and further divide objects into suckable, grabbable, pokeable, and so on. And this is the developmental analog of accommodation and can be compared to Jack's modification of dog to exclude cat. Assimilation and accommodation help children incorporate new information into their schemas and order the world more completely. Piaget argued that the conflict between assimilation and accommodation is what drove intellectual growth. That they're presented with these challenges, this doesn't necessarily fit here, so I have to make a new order in order for it to fit here. So accommodation helps children develop more sophisticated systems of categorizing information, since new and modified schemas are created in response to objects not fitting in the pre-developed schemas. But assimilation allows children to gather information quickly and to interact with the world in ways for which they're best developmentally suited. And together, assimilation and accommodation work to help children learn quickly and with increasing sophistication. Everybody kind of get an idea of that? Questions? Everybody's pretty good. I'm going to unmute all of you here real quick.
I didn't mean to leave the conversation. I accidentally closed out the tab.
Yeah,
I'm back.
And I'm probably going to have to set it, no offense to you, to where we can't change the backgrounds because it's a bit confusing.
Dang it.
And I just read an article this morning, a lot of college professors using Zoom, and they've people have figured out that it's called Zoom bombing. And so they're putting like pornographic images or racial.
Oh, this is my cat. It's not.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I'm not saying you are doing it. I'm just saying I'm worried about someone coming in here who might not be one of our students either. Doing it. So I'm probably gonna have to set the settings so you can't change the background like that.
Dang
But there
it.
was a time when I looked down at the students and all I see is your cat. I'm like, is that a real cat staring at me? Is that a picture or what is that? So you guys ruined it for me today. I was like, oh, the temperature is great. The sun's out, and now it's all overcast. I'm looking out my window right now, and
It's gonna rain.
I know. It usually happens in the spring when it warms up. You get rain. But, so there goes my day. Thanks a lot. So you guys have any questions? Have you tried reading the book any since you left, the chapters I gave you?
I've literally been doing scholarships all day, every day.
Well, that's good. You got time to do that. Do that.
Yeah, it's not working. I don't have a printer at my house, so we're like struggling.
Yeah. Well, I'd say come print it at my house, but I don't have a printer here either. It broke when we moved. So.
Yeah, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but it's fine. It's fine. I'll figure it out.
All right. Well, if we don't have anything else, then I'm going to go ahead and end this meeting. And we will not meet tomorrow. We'll come back and meet Monday. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So you guys have a good weekend. I'll see you later.